Reality is that one big industry that Australia has depended on historically for employment is going to decline and then disappear.
Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts and get ready for a journey into the superpower future. Today on the Second Renaissance, we have the honour of introducing a visionary and futurist economist who's been mapping out the sustainable future of our world for years, Dr. Ross Garnaut. With a keen eye for economics, sustainability and the environment, Dr. Garnaut's thoughts and insights are a window into a better and more sustainable tomorrow. He's been shaping the discourse on how we can create a world that is not just economically prosperous, but also environmentally conscious for the last 20 years. In today's episode, we sit down to decode his latest books, Superpower and Superpower Transformation, and the latest exponential potential for Australia in the decarbonised future. It's an energising conversation with a climate optimist, but also a sobering wake-up call for immediate climate action. Now, a few words on pedigree. Ross Garnaut, AO, is one of Australia's leading economists and thinkers. He's a professorial fellow in economics and a vice-chancellor's fellow at the University of Melbourne, as well as a distinguished professor of the Australian National University. In September 2008, Professor Garnaut presented the Garnaut Climate Change Review to the Australian Prime Minister. He was a key economic advisor to the reforming Hawke government, and Garnaut has held senior roles in government and business, including as Australian ambassador to China and climate change advisor to the Rudd and Gillard governments. So hold on tight as we explore the exciting possibilities of the electrifying future with none other than one of my climate superheroes, Dr. Ross Garnaut, here on the Second Renaissance podcast. Ross Garnaut, welcome to the Second Renaissance and great to see you again.
Great to see you, Anders, again after meeting in the coal past and renewable energy future region of central Queensland.
Yeah, that's right. We spent some time together last year with the RCOE, or the Resources Centre of Excellence up in Mackay, talking about this big superpower transformation that we'll be talking about at the Second Renaissance today, Ross. And that might actually lead me to one of the first questions that's been on my mind, which is when we were working in central Queensland, in very, very traditional coal mining communities and fossil fuel-based economies. I mean, how do you sell this idea or this innovation of the renewable future, and how does it go down in coal mining communities when you speak about the very, very different future compared to what you might call the dog days?
Well, I'm never selling this vision, Anders. I'm just talking about a reality and helping to explain a reality. And that reality is that one big industry that region, more than any other in Australia, has depended on historically for employment and incomes, is going to decline and then disappear. The coal industry. Coal's been a great part of central Queensland's past, a great part of Australia's past, a great part of the world's past. We would not have had the huge beneficial transformation of the Industrial Revolution without coal, but it's done its job. And we're now aware that if it continues as it was in the past, we will destabilise the climate on which all of our civilization depends. In fact, we started to do that, and we're seeing great damage from that. Central Queensland's seeing great damage from that. Along that beautiful coast, a lot of the horticultural industries, nurseries wiped out in a couple of cyclonic events with floods over the last few years. That's been great, but it's the past, and it just happens that the future is going to draw on other resources that region has. And the region that I describe in my book, The Superpower Transformation, as the rhombus of reliability, a rhombus-shaped area from Gladstone in the south on the coast of Queensland, central Queensland, to Townsville in North Queensland, going inland over what Australians call the Great Dividing Range into the flat, sunlit country beyond that. Within that region, you've got extraordinarily renewable energy resources. You have to go west of the mountains to get the perfect sunshine and to avoid the cyclones disrupting solar farms. In the mountains, you've got wonderful country for wind power. You've got extraordinary opportunities for pumped hydro storage, for storing renewable energy. And along the coast and in the mountains, you've got some of the world's richest horticultural resources, a source of biomass, which is very valuable as a source of zero emissions industrial inputs in the emerging zero emissions world economy. So it just happens that region's been very successful in the past, built on the old sources of energy, and if we don't muck it up, will be very successful in future based on the new source of energy. I haven't seen my job as selling anything, just analysing the reality and explaining that. And I find that, yes, there are mixed responses. Naturally, there's anxiety, especially in the early days of talking about these changes, anxiety amongst people who know how much they've depended on the old resources. But increasingly, there's realisation that the new opportunities are very large, and the sooner that these communities get on board, the easier the transition will be. So there's actually a positive, not universal, but generally positive view of moving from the successful past to a different successful future.
So this is something that strikes me. Obviously, Australia's economy partly buoyed by the rise of China over the last 30-odd years. And I know you have a past as the Australian ambassador to China in the late 80s, I believe. But Australia, in some ways, people have said, became China's quarry and certainly helped us avoid a recession for many, many years based upon some of our, old school fossil fuel resources. But the future is about renewable resources and renewable energy. And this is what leads to both of these fantastic books that I've had an opportunity to sit down and digest over the last little while during the summer holidays. But in the book, and I'm keen for a clarification, in the book, The Superpower Transformation, that has come out since the Australian election of 2022, you're talking about these endowments and these opportunities that Australia has that are quite unique, and you've just begun to explore some of those. But what you're saying in the book is that Australia can supply zero emissions goods and services that directly reduce global emissions by around 8%, which is much more than Europe, including the UK, achieving zero net emissions, or more than twice Japan, or more than India doing so. Can you just explore this with us and how Australia has this outsized opportunity, not just to become a superpower in and of itself in a decarbonised future, but also just the global impact of Australia doing so? Yes,
Anders. Well, the opportunity and the responsibility of associated with these resources is built on 5 kinds of advantages. First, the world's richest combinations of solar and wind resources. Where we were in Queensland, near the Tropic of Capricorn, follow that line to the west, and that's just about the best solar country in the world. Go further north and you get more cloud in the tropical areas. Go further south and you get more cloud and also uneven sunlight hours between summer and winter. But that's a real sweet spot across that Tropic of Capricorn. Very good through much of Australia. When I did my big review on climate change for all the governments, state and federal, of Australia back in 2007, 2008, I was visited by the director of the German solar program, and he'd done his homework, and with some regret he shared with me the feelings he'd had when he realised that the very worst places for solar energy in Australia, the west coast of Tasmania, are better than the best in Germany, but you've got a real sweet spot near the Tropic of Capricorn. And wind resources are excellent in many places, and the combination of excellent solar and excellent wind brings down the cost of supplying renewable energy, means you need less storage to keep servicing industries using renewable energy. So that's the first resource. It's actually not only the quality of the resources, which are very high, but the space to put them in. Even if Germany or Japan or central or coastal China or Korea had wind and solar resources as good as Australia's, and they don't, but even if they did, where would you put hundreds of square kilometres of solar panels in any of those countries or regions? But Australia has the space to deploy them. Wind takes up less land, but it does affect other things that are going on the land, and again, Australia's wide open spaces, the low ratios of population to land area give it a special advantage. So the first big asset of Australia in the New World is the unusual, the exceptional combinations of high quality wind and solar resources. The second is that Australia happens to have, more than any other country, an abundance of the mineral resources that are necessary to build the machines of the zero emissions world economy. The building of all the solar panels, the wind turbines, the batteries, the transmission lines, the electric cars that we need to remove emissions requires very large quantities of minerals that have been in some demand in the past, but small demand. The International Energy Agency has estimated there'll need to be a 700% increase in the volume of production of a wide range of what it calls critical minerals. I prefer to call them, and use in the book, the Superpower Transformation, use the term energy transition minerals. Some that were in large demand in the old economy, but much larger in the new, like copper and cobalt and nickel, and others that were in relatively small demand in the old economy and huge in the new. Silicon, the main active component in the photovoltaic panel, graphite for batteries, rare earths, special minerals like titanium, vanadium, and it just happens that Australia is the first or the second or the third largest source of, or potential source of, these energy transition minerals. That's the second advantage. The third is that there are certain minerals that are required in huge quantities in the world economy, old and new, that require very large amounts of energy for transformation of the mineral into usable metals. The biggest of these is iron. About 7% of global emissions is derived simply from transforming iron ore, iron oxide, into iron metal. But aluminium's another one. You need huge amounts of electricity to convert aluminium oxide, the ore, into aluminium metal. One that's going to be hugely important in the zero emissions world economy is silicon, for making the photovoltaic panels, also for, panels, but also the chips in the computers, the mobile phones that are becoming more and more important, hugely important in the electric car. Silicon, it requires even more energy compared with value than aluminium does, and it's going to be a huge industry. So the countries that have large amounts of energy for processing are going to have special advantages if they've also got the energy transition minerals requiring a lot of energy for processing, and other minerals like iron. Now, Australia also has an advantage in iron making, one might think, in the old economy, because we've also got the world's best metallurgical coal resources. We're a huge exporter of metallurgical coal to China, Japan, Korea, some to Europe. Why isn't that used in Australia now? Well, it doesn't cost much to ship metallurgical coal from Mackay, where we were together last year, to the great steelmaking centres of China, Japan, Korea, Germany. But it's different for renewable energy. You can shift renewable energy and renewable electricity between continents with electric cables. This will happen, and there's a very big project that'll supply a substantial part of Singapore's requirements by transmission cable under the water from northern Australia to Singapore across Indonesian waters. That can be done, but it's very expensive, and the power will be more than twice as expensive at the other end as it is in Australia. You can turn renewable energy into hydrogen, and hydrogen made from renewable energy is the zero emissions route for transforming iron ore into iron metal. You could take Australian hydrogen made from renewable energy and take it to China or Japan or Korea or Germany and make it there. But unlike metallurgical coal, the transportation costs are very high compared with the value of the material. It's going to cost much more than twice as much to use Australian hydrogen in those countries, or Australian renewable electricity, as it is to use it in Australia. The differential's tiny for metallurgical coal. In fact, it's cheaper to transport metallurgical coal from Mackay in Queensland to Japan or China or Korea than to take it to the steelworks in Whyalla in South Australia. So there'll be huge economic pressures to do the processing in Australia. And Australia happens to be the world's main source of those minerals that require a lot of energy for processing. Australia is by far the world's biggest exporter of iron ore. China produces more than half the world's steel, and 60% of the imports of iron ore for that come from Australia. Australia is the natural location for processing with zero emissions iron ore, aluminium ore, silicon oxide, other minerals into products for global markets. The fourth big advantage is that in the zero emissions world economy, growing biomass has great economic value. And we think of Australia, and Australia is a relatively dry continent, the driest of the inhabited continents. And so naturally, less biomass grows per hectare, but there are a lot of hectares and not many people. And as a result, at present, woodlands in Australia are present in 10 times the quantity compared with population as they are in the developed world as a whole. And the developed world has much more land for biomass than developing countries. So that's another advantage in two ways. There's one old technology that's been proven for taking carbon from the atmosphere and capturing it securely on Earth, and that's a technology that's got a proven track record of over 1 billion years. It's called photosynthesis. That's lots of talk is going on around mechanical means of capturing carbon dioxide and bring it down to Earth and then securing it, storing it in geological structures. Well, some of that might happen, but that's not proven technology. There's one proven one, photosynthesis, and Australia's in a uniquely favourable position to do that on a large scale, either for capturing carbon and storing it in the ground, a source of negative emissions, or for sustainably growing biomass, growing trees on a sustainable basis, harvesting it, using the biomass as a zero-emission source of hydrocarbons and carbon for industry to replace the oil and coal and gas that's currently used in industry. We'll replace a lot of the coal and oil that's used in industry by synthetic chemicals made from hydrogen and electricity and other materials that have zero emissions, but there'll be a core of industrial products where it's very difficult to replace carbon and hydrocarbon. And the zero emissions way of producing those in future is going to be using biomass, and Australia's got big advantages in that. And the fifth advantage is Australia now, certainly per head of population and relative to the size of the population, it's got by far the world's biggest agglomeration of skills and management capacities related to mining, metallurgy, agriculture, forestry, and these skills, and also the physical infrastructure in the mining, agricultural and forestry industries, provide a very strong start for the industries of the zero-emission future. We'll see that at the place that we were at in Mackay, where the Centre of Excellence for Resources was built around innovation and training for the old resource industries, especially coal, but those same skills, those same capacities for innovation are going to be crucial for the zero emissions industries of the future, the new resource industries of the future. And a lot of the infrastructure, the transmission lines, the ports, will be given new value, longer life through use for producing the essential products of the zero emissions economy. So this inheritance of skills and infrastructure from the old resources industries provides a very good start for the new resources industry. So they're the five advantages. Put them together. No one else got anything like them. And use that opportunity well. It will be much cheaper for the densely populated countries of Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and Europe. Be much cheaper for them to import semi-processed materials embodying Australian renewable energy than it will be for them to use their own more expensive solar and wind resources to make zero emissions industries. And that's where my figure 8% comes from. Australia plays a very big role now in supplying fossil energy and fossil reductants to the economies of Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea. And that 8% is based on a presumption that we can get the same share of Northeast Asian markets for renewable energy as we get for coal and gas now. And it's presumed that's the presumption about Korea and Japan, and it presumes a relatively low proportion of the markets of China and Europe. So the 8% is a little bit conservative, but even on that basis, Australia plays a crucial role in allowing decarbonisation to work in Europe and in Northeast Asia.
So, hearing about those abundant endowments in Australia, the question that emerges in my mind is why on earth have we not seized this opportunity in an enthusiastic fashion up until very, very recently? And if it is now a paradigm shift or a shift in the zeitgeist, what's led to that shift?
Our economy at the moment is dominated proportionately more than any other developed countries by the old fossil energy industries, coal and gas. These industries represent a very high proportion of the value of stocks on the Australian Stock Exchange. They're in an industry that depends on government regulation. Under the Australian Constitution, all of those resources, all of the coal and the iron ore, belongs to the state, and then the state leases access to them to private miners. In principle, all the rent value could, and some would say should, go to the people who own it, the people of Australia. But that's not the way we've run things. And the fossil energy industries are deeply involved in politics. Their business starts with politics. Their business starts with getting exclusive rights to mined ore deposits. 150 years ago, we did things in a different way. 170 years ago, we had the great goldfields of Victoria and New South Wales. We had gold rushes, and anyone could come in and peg a little claim, a few square metres, and start digging, and some would do well, some wouldn't. And European and Chinese settlers came to Australia in very large numbers in the first place. Australia was populated from the gold rush. We don't do it like that now. We give a single company exclusive rights. We make it illegal for anyone else to come and have an iron ore rush. We give an exclusive right to mine iron ore in Western Australia to 4 or 5 very big companies. And it's illegal for anyone else to go and peg a claim and dig a bit of iron ore and send it off to Japan. And so the business of the resource industries is built around relations with government. They've been very good and very successful, very effective in investing in politics to avoid the community getting much in the way of taxation and royalties out of those industries. Australia's been a bit different. For example, from Norway, where the state did collect most of the rents, and as a result, the state's been in a very strong position to invest in the energy transition. But we've done it differently, and that different history means a different politics. And so those old vested interests have been very powerful in shaping the political conversation and shaping policy. Old established industries get a vote and can contribute to political parties. New industries don't, because they don't exist yet. Employees of the coal industry get a vote now because they know who they are, but employees in the new industries don't know who they are and don't know who they're going to be. In any political system, the past gets a vote, the future doesn't. That's one thing. And in the Australian political economy, the old resource industries have been particularly effective in resisting change. Resisting in a whole lot of ways. Part of the resistance comes from disinformation, colouring the discourse, raising doubts about whether climate change is a problem or whether anything serious can be done about it. Now, you ask, why is that changing now? It's changing because the reality of climate change is pressing itself upon Australia as it's pressing itself upon the world. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was still quite a lot of people who thought that climate science was crap, that atmospheric physics taught in the universities was wrong. There was no basis for it, and today it's only the fringe, a relatively unimportant politically fringe of the population that thinks physics is rubbish. What's changed that more than anything else is actually being able to see the effects of climate change on bushfires, heat waves, more variable rainfall, more cyclonic events, more flooding events. We can see the damage. A second reason why things have changed is that the rest of the world, the rest of the developed world in particular, has gone more rapidly than Australia on addressing these issues, and as the rest of the world adjusts, then they're making it clear they're not prepared to allow business as usual in countries that continue to depend on fossil fuels. And the influence from abroad comes in many ways. Partly geopolitical. Close ally, the United States, is now under administration of President Biden that takes this issue very seriously. And when we had a government led by Prime Minister Morrison that wasn't taking the issue seriously, this became a contentious issue in our relations with the United States. In Europe, it's become clear that if Australia is to get a satisfactory free trade agreement, it has to take account of European concerns and priorities for dealing with climate change. Along with that negative geopolitical pressure comes opportunities. Europe from 2026 will place a tax on imports that contain carbon unless that carbon has been taxed in the country of origin. And so we're finding that many Australian industries are seeking ways of reducing emissions to avoid that European tax. For many products, for example, many of our farm products, the world's highest price markets are in Europe. If you want access to those markets, you're going to have to either point to a zero-emission supply chain or pay a tax on entry to Europe. And that concentrates the mind. And so a lot of industries that a few years ago weren't taking this issue very seriously are realising they've got to move. In addition, Australia is deeply integrated into world financial markets. A lot of our equity for investment comes from abroad. A lot of debt for investment comes from abroad. And a lot of the main institutions that are the sources of finance are making it clear they're not prepared to support investment in the old high carbon industries, not prepared to support investment in countries that aren't taking climate change seriously. So that is forcing change. So there are both positive and negative reasons. I think that the thing that will really push Australia on very rapidly is the positive reason, the recognition that as the rest of the world changes, there's a huge opportunity to use Australian resources to help those other countries move more quickly to zero emissions and create employment and incomes in Australia at the same time.
So both carrot and stick approach here, potentially access to lucrative markets and ensuring we still are able to supply our resources, our outputs from manufacturing. And I'm also hearing the opportunity for actually onshoring, refinement and processing capabilities back to Australia, and maybe the sort of lost opportunities of the past, where some of our resources have just being part of a quarry and then put on a ship to China or elsewhere, whereas some of the capabilities, particularly in a renewable future, should be nationalized and localized much closer to some of the sources of renewable power, for example. What are the we've heard about the climate upside here. If we're climate optimists and we believe in a superpower transformation, why is Australia, just as it has this opportunity to participate and drive a decarbonised future, what are the downside risks and why are they outsized in Australia compared to other regions or other nations? I guess I'm looking at both sides of the fence here, and the fact that there is a massive upside, but similarly, if we don't mitigate, Australia seems to be one of the most fragile and most vulnerable economies and countries in the developed world if climate change is unleashed in a massive way, and when we have above 2 degrees of warming, etc.
Well, Australia is the most vulnerable of the developed countries. I went through the explanation of that in my big review for the federal and state governments given to the heads of government back in 2008, 15 years ago. We're the most vulnerable country for a number of reasons. One is that we're already a hot and dry country, and so make it hotter and you take a lot of human activities into uncharted climate country. If it gets a bit warmer in Russia, you can start to apply the agricultural technologies that they use in Germany or England. Get a bit warmer in England and you can start to apply some of the technologies they use in Australia. But Australia's got to invent something completely new if it gets hotter in Australia. And we've got by far the world's most variable rainfall, as well as the lowest average rainfall of the inhabited continents. And so even if average rainfall doesn't change, increased variability increases vulnerability when you're already at the margin of availability of water in large parts of the country. So we're vulnerable in that sense. One point that I emphasised in my major reports 15 years ago is that Australia is the only developed country that lives mainly in a region of developing countries. All of our neighbours are developing countries, and developing countries, especially poorer developing countries, poor and low and middle income developing countries, will find it very difficult to adapt to climate change. A rich country, the Netherlands, is used to keeping out the seas, but building seawalls and dikes, and in future we'll see a lot more of that. And a rich country can do that, but a poor country will have great difficulty in doing that. And so displacement of people will be much more important in the densely populated regions of Southeast and South Asia than in the developed countries. And Australia is the only developed country adjacent to those regions. Also, our trade and our economic relations depend on trade with developing countries far more than any other developed country does. Most of our trade is with developing countries. China, by far our biggest market. It's bigger than our next 10 export markets put together. And if you look at Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a group, they'd be our second biggest market. India, very large and getting bigger, and so China is becoming rich enough probably to be able to build the adaptive responses, although China is very vulnerable to climate change itself. More doubtful whether Southeast and South Asia will be able to protect themselves in that way. So we're very vulnerable both economically and geopolitically from instability in Southeast and South Asia. So and a lot of our great national environmental assets, the unique barrier reefs, the Great Barrier Reef off Queensland, Ningaloo Reef off Western Australia, are vulnerable to relatively small amounts of additional warming. We're getting close to the limits now where they will be severely damaged. The beautiful wetlands of northern Australia, Kakadu, the most famous of them, are very liable to saline inundation if you get much of an increase at all in sea level rise. And other countries have vulnerabilities, but it's hard to think of others that have such wonderful national assets so precariously placed in relation to climate change. So taking all of those things together, Australia is the most vulnerable of the developed countries. We're already getting close to the point where damage is very severe. Well, we're already suffering severe damage. A reminder of that again this summer with the flooding across a very wide range of places in Australia. We were reminded of it a few years ago with the bushfires across much of Australia. But we're close to points where that could get much worse. Certainly global warming above 2 degrees would be devastating for Australia, above 1.5 serious. We're already at over 1.1, so it's getting very close to very dangerous points. And Pretty obvious once people think about it and take seriously the scientific evidence that Australia has a huge interest in avoiding that downside.
Absolutely. So we've had a change in government in May 2022. The Albanese government stepped in, and even Anthony Albanese has talked about this idea of Australia becoming a superpower. But events of 2022, and today we're recording in 2023, just at the beginning of, we also saw in 2022 other geopolitical developments like the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the associated increase in oil and gas prices around the world. What are these, what's the shift in government in Australia, but also these geopolitical factors? Are they accelerating Australia's shift towards the renewable economy, or is there a further awakening on a political level or even on a consumer level that renewables are the way to go?
Certainly the shift in the Commonwealth Government of Australia, the defeat of the Morrison government, is a very big shift facilitating effective action to make use of the new opportunities. The old Liberal National Party coalition government was in practice resistant to recognising the realities, in practice blind both to the realities of the potential damage from climate change and blind to the opportunity. So the change of government was very important. It's not that the new government came in committed to exceptionally strong action by global standards, but it took Australia back into the mainstream. Probably on the policies that went to the election, probably still a bit behind the average, but it took us back to the mainstream, and that was a huge shift. And given our advantages in the zero emissions economy, just being part of the general swim places you in a good position. It was a big change. And in office, the government has quickly implemented the policies on climate change on which it was elected, and continued to emphasise appreciation of the superpower opportunity. The Prime Minister mentioned that as one of his main objectives on the night of his election back in May last year. The election was important beyond the change of government. It swept from office Conservative representatives in all of the big cities who were in electorates that had voted Conservative in the whole of Australian history. The richest suburban areas of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, that had never voted anything other than Liberal National Party or Liberal Party before. In Australia, they're the Conservative parties, tossed out the incumbent members, and in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, voted in candidates who by social background and inclination probably were natural supporters of the old Liberal Party, but couldn't stomach the Morrison government's attitude to climate change, amongst some other issues. The other big issues, integrity in government and gender issues, but climate was a huge one. And anyone looking at that result can see that if the Conservative parties want to return to government, they will have to recapture what used to be their heartland, and that has to reject climate denial, because that's clearly unacceptable to those electorates which are essential parts of the base of any Conservative government. So that's a second. It wasn't just the change of government to a Labor government that was ready to bring Australia back to the mainstream. It was a wider political message in that election that shows that a change back to old positions is necessary if conservative parties are to rule again. The Ukraine issues, of course, are different. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, tragic in itself, severely disrupted global energy markets and led to much higher prices for coal and gas and oil, and that greatly increased the profitability of the old industries in Australia. And many people have used that as an opportunity to argue that these industries are so important that we should do everything we can to extend their life and to slow down the transmission. I don't think that has been hugely influential in the general Australian discussion, but certainly those arguments are present. More importantly, is what effect it's had in the global discussion. Certainly, when gas and coal became scarce in Europe, many people in Europe began to wonder whether quick access to new sources of supply and commitments to long-term purchase of new sources of supply of coal and gas and oil would give them more energy security. So there was a big debate for a little while in those urgent circumstances in the first half of last year. But my reading of it is that on the whole, that taught Europe that it needs to accelerate the movement to zero emissions. And it's concentrated the minds of many Europeans, for example, in Germany, on the difficulties of meeting all of their energy needs from renewable energy at home and the advantages of cooperation with a country like Australia that can meet many of their needs at much lower cost. So my current assessment, and this is a really difficult and tragic situation with dimensions way beyond energy, of course, but my current assessment on energy is that on balance it's accelerated the pressures for transition.
Now I'm in one of those electorates in Sydney, and certainly you felt the energy shift amongst people backing a teal independent here in Dr. Sophie Scomps on the northern beaches. But similarly to that idea, and you're talking about the renewable transition and the acceleration. On a personal note, my wife often tells me about her dream of having a north-facing property where solar installations would make a lot of sense. And she says, at the moment we're southeast facing, looking back from Newport down towards Manly and across the northern beaches, and it's a southeast facing house. And so I had to do some research on this in terms of solar installations. And you mentioned Germany a little while ago, and some of the research I came across said that in Australia, if you're south facing, so away from it's not the most ideal position in terms of capturing sun rays, is still 4 times as efficient in terms of gathering the solar energy as being south-facing in Germany, which of course has a huge installation base as well, and in terms of solar. So we are in the sunburnt country and a sunlit country. We are in many ways already solar powered in terms of our agricultural system, etc. So huge opportunities for the future. And perhaps this is, given we're entering the sort of end zone here, Ross, I wanted to just check, in your perspective, if you think about both, small enterprise and entrepreneurs and businesses, as well as large companies. I mean, to avoid becoming stranded assets and to fully embrace the opportunities of the decarbonised future, what are some practical things that we can do either on a business level or even on an individual household level to embrace some of the opportunities but also avoid some of the risks associated with climate change?
Well, the Australian advantage is so large, Anders, that the many Australian businesses and households that could actually lower their costs and do better economically now just by accelerating the transition. Australia's the natural home of the electric car. We got an electric vehicle a few months ago. We can, for driving around Melbourne, we easily fill it, keep it filled with the surplus solar from our roof during the daytime. If you go on a long trip, of course, you need to plug in along the way, and that can be done at low cost with renewable energy, and we'll become more and more efficient at that. But in the big cities of Australia, and Australia is the most urbanised country on earth, has been for 150 years, opportunities for a standalone house to meet all of its house requirements and its metropolitan energy requirements just from the solar off the roof, it has huge economic advantages. That's already recognised by many Australians. It's been held back by the failure of government policies to recognise the opportunity in the past, and we're correcting that now. Of all the developed countries, we had the lowest uptake of EVs in the world. We have up till now, but that will change very quickly. The natural advantages will drive the change as soon as government policy ceases to be antipathetic to the change. For business, it's always hard for established businesses that have done very well from an old model to move to a new one. For that reason, really, when there's big structural change that increases efficiency for the economy as a whole, it's very unusual for that to be led by incumbents. When I was young, and you were very young, the one company, IBM, had most of the world's computer market and employed most of the world's most capable computing engineers, electrical engineers. If you'd said then, in 2 generations' time, every household's going to have a computer on a desk, which companies are going to do well? Well, without thinking, we would have all said, well, IBM will do that. But 5 different sets of kids in garages outcompeted them, created the new economy, and now each of them is worth much more than IBM. Very hard for incumbents to drive innovation. It means such a change in mindset, and so we see great companies like Woodside and Santos inventing reasons for going slowly rather than using their skills and management capacities to lead the new. That's sad, and does risk stranded assets. Sad, but that's one of the great virtues of capitalism, that it can destroy constructively companies and assets that are not adjusting to economic change. And so the message for established industries is give some thought to what you will lose if you're not part of building the future, not at the forefront of that. Those big established fossil energy companies could make a lot of money now just by enjoying the high prices, giving that back to their shareholders as dividends or share buybacks, just letting their shareholders benefit from the high prices without wasting resources, investing in new capacity that runs the risk of being stranded. So for the established industries, so important for Australia, so important for the past and for the present, it would be great if they looked after their shareholders' interest by enjoying the high profits of the present by giving money back to their shareholders rather than wasting it by investing it in assets that won't have as good a future as current prices suggest they might have.
Yeah, and I think being mindful of time, I think there's something to learn from the Norwegian experiment, which is that you don't have to be perfect necessarily, but you do need to get started. And even while they're enjoying, legacy incomes from oil and gas exploration, they are fully investing it into a renewable future where, 97% of energy in households in Norway, at least, yes, they're exporting some of these fossil fuels elsewhere, but 97% of household energy comes from renewables already. So I think that approach, even as a mindset, is quite important. Yes, there are old school revenues, but make sure that we invest them into a sustainable future where the rise of the conscious consumer, the conscious investor, stakeholders and talent won't want to touch your company unless your supply chain and unless your energies are sourced in a renewable fashion. Ross Garnaut, it's been great to have you on the Second Renaissance. Thank you for setting such a good stage and finally also seeing that there's some political will to back some of the great ideas that you've been espousing for decades. So thank you for being on the Second Renaissance today.
Nice to talk to you, Anders. And your international readers can get the book, The Superpower Transformation, online from the publishers Black Ink, if they and Australians, of course, can go down to the local bookstore.
Yeah, and I've been picking these up with my very localised Avalon bookstore at Bucacino. So I've ordered them through the bookstore, which of course you can do. You can get them on Amazon or maybe even get your local bookstore to order them. And I'm a big fan of both the books. So there's plenty more to check out as well. Ross, great to have you on the show. For more information about the Second Renaissance and our work on sustainable innovation, please visit my website, www.sorman-Nilsson.com. We would appreciate if you can take a moment to share the podcast with a friend or a colleague and help build the movement. We hope that what we learn together on the Second Renaissance can help us all build a sustainable future for ourselves and our children. See you in the near future.